and welcome you all. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for choosing our breakout room. We are quite sure it is the best one, so we're sure you've made the right choice. Um, I do want to say, if you are not familiar with the Nevada Mathematics Education Leadership Council, I have our website up on the screen, and we are the Nevada affiliate of the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics, the Leadership in Mathematics Education organization, kind of the leadership side, similar to NCTM, if you're familiar with that. And so we encourage you to look at our website, look at the resources that we have, consider joining us, or at least joining a mailing list if you just want to dip a toe in the water. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker today is Dr. Paul Gray, and amongst his many accolades, which you can read about in the Canvas portal, and I'm sure you did when you were selecting the best room for this morning, you'll notice that he is the current president of NCSM. So we are very lucky that he has spent his morning with us, only a little bit afternoon for him, to share his expertise. And we thank you from our Nevada teacher hearts, and I will kick it over to you, Paul.
Okay. So we'll do the creative screen swap here. And good morning, everybody. As Heather said, my name is Paul Gray. I am the current NCSM president, and I live in Dallas, Texas. I'm a Texas boy. You can probably tell by my accent what part of the continent I came from. I grew up in the Houston area, and that's where I taught and was a math leader. My teaching background is high school and middle school math and science. And I graduated with the kids to high school, and they needed a math teacher more than a science teacher. So that kind of set me in the math pathway. And then I fell in love with working with my colleagues. I thought helping teachers figure out things together and being part of that process really made me happy as a math teacher. And so that kind of nudged me in the math leadership direction. And I became a curriculum specialist at the regional level. I was the director of math and science for a school district in Houston. And then decided I really like teaching and learning. And so became a consultant, because being an administrator at the district level, you get more in an administrative bend. And that just wasn't my passion. There are people that enjoy administrative roles, and you have the potential to make a big difference in the lives of teachers and students. And I'm really glad that there are people out there with that drive and that skill set. I just realized I'm not one of them. Teaching and learning is my passion. And so being a consultant and an author is a way that I can do that. So I typically begin my presentations with a land acknowledgement. And since we're virtual, I decided to showcase and acknowledge the ancestral lands of where I am right now. I mentioned that I'm from Texas and I live in Dallas. Right now, though, I'm at my summer place in Provincetown, because Texas is scorching and there's actually breathable air in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is at the very tip of Cape Cod. And this is the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag Nation. And most people would recognize the Wampanoag Nation as the indigenous people that were here when the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Pilgrims, arrived from England. And clever marketing from Plymouth talks about Plymouth Rock, and Plymouth is the settlement where the Pilgrims ended up building their home. But when they came over from England, the Mayflower first docked in Provincetown Harbor. And this is Cape Cod. What we now call Cape Cod was inhabited by the Nauset Nation and the Wampanoag Nation. And the Wampanoag Nation continues to be here. Their ancestors have been here that they can document for upwards of 10,000 years. And the Wampanoag Nation today has its headquarters in Mashpee, which is on the lower part of Cape Cod, but they are still contributing to the culture in Southeast Massachusetts and to the traditional landscape that's here. So as we go through our learning today, I would invite you to consider not only how do we serve our indigenous populations, but also thinking about the students and teachers that we serve that come from different marginalized communities. And how can we help make mathematics, powerful mathematics, more accessible to all of our students, including those from marginalized populations. So we have about an hour-ish today. And so this is kind of my agenda. This is the roadmap for where our learning journey together this morning is going to take us. We're going to start by a brief overview of what is culturally relevant instruction. And if you were in the keynote, Alan talked a little bit about at the end about some of the different models of culturally responsive teaching and culturally relevant teaching. So we're going to dig into a little bit of that because I think it sets the background for what we mean when I say leading culturally relevant instruction. The next stop in our journey, we're going to talk about different stages of math tasks. I'm going to give you a model where you can kind of think about what the math tasks that we have, how culturally relevant might they be to the students in my room. And then we're going to look at some tools and processes that you can use in your work with teachers to guide them through some of that self-reflection in professional learning community type study. Thinking specifically about how do we make our tasks that we have more culturally relevant. I'm going to give you some tools that you can use to help answer that question. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with some reflections and implications. Why is this work important? Why is it worth doing? So Heather talked about NMELC, the Nevada Math Leadership Group, but I want to tell you about NCSM. NCSM is an initialism that stood for the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics. We were founded in 1968 at an NCTM meeting, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And there were some math leaders from school districts around the country that got together and said, we love NCTM, but we really need a group that helps us, that doesn't focus so much on what's happening in the classroom, but what are some strategies and practices that we can use in our work with teachers. It was pretty much like their own support group, math leaders from around the country. So NCSM today, in 1968, supervisors is what we called ourselves. If you were leading mathematics, you were the math coordinator, the math specialist for your school district, you were called a math supervisor. It was the clinical supervision model in the 60s that was in vogue. What we would call coaching now, they called clinical supervision. So that's where the S came from. So now we think of ourselves as NCSM, Leadership in Mathematics Education. And I'm a little biased, but I'm going to brag. We are the premier mathematics education leadership organization on the continent. We have members from across the United States as well as Canada. We're a professional learning network. NCSM is where math leaders go to learn and to learn, not only learn from NCSM resources, but also from our fellow members. Because a lot of times you will encounter something and it's new to you, but I promise it's not new to somebody else. It's something a road they've been down before. So that's expertise that we can tap within our own professional learning network. NCSM produces an annual conference that is full of sessions for people who lead mathematics and people that lead math teachers. This year, our conference is in Washington, D.C. next month. I keep saying, oh, it's in October, but then I realized, oh, that's next month. So I'll tell you more about that there at the end. NCSM also is focused on equity for all teachers and all students to experience high-quality mathematics teaching and learning. We are 2,200 members strong. We're a source for resources so that you can do your job better as a math leader. So the first thing I want to talk about, I want to share with you some information about the different models for culturally based instruction. So I've got QR codes in here. You're certainly welcome to use those. But since we're back on Zoom, I can also drop links in the chat box, which I learned in the COVID days of everything being virtual. I really like having a chat box to drop links in. It's a good way to share information. So the QR code's how I can do that in person. So you'll get the information two ways. So the link to the document that I just put in the chat box is kind of a summary of 3 different models for cultural instruction. Gloria Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant instruction model, Geneva Gay's culturally responsive instruction, and then the shoot, there's a third one that's eluding me right now, but it's in that document and it's not showcased in the presentation. Culturally sustaining practices, that's the third one. And that comes from Django and Paris. It's a newer scholarship. The others are more established. So we're going to start, I'm going to talk about Gloria Ladson-Billings' model for culturally relevant pedagogy. And she's a professor emerita at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and she created this framework in 1994 in her book, The Dream Keepers. In essence, the notion of culturally relevant instruction is teaching in which students are empowered by aspects of their own culture to engage in their own learning. So teachers that use culturally relevant instruction don't view culture as like an add-on, like Problem Solving Fridays, where you do naked math Monday through Thursday, and then Friday, oh yay, we're problem solving. So we're not doing cultural Mondays. Cultural relevance is embedded in all aspects of the classroom, and that culture becomes part of the mathematics classroom. In this model, there are 3 pillars for culturally relevant pedagogy. And originally she called them pillars, but as with any model, once you've put it out there and you get some feedback on it, Dr. Ladson-Billings realized these are really more like tenets. It's like a triangle, 3 things that come together, because if you're not doing one of them, the whole framework falls apart. But the first piece, the first tenet in her framework is academic excellence. And this is something we absolutely must pay attention to. And honestly, this is why we go to school to begin with. We want students to excel and interact with powerful mathematics. If we don't tend to the content, then what happens is we get a feel-good curriculum that makes students feel good about themselves, but they leave our classes without the mathematics they need to be successful. And if we don't attend to academic excellence, we end up with a lot of chances for inequities, and that's problematic. So for example, we know from historical practice that typically students of color and multilingual learners are paired with teachers who have less experience. And so what ends up happening is that those students aren't given access to the rigorous, meaningful mathematics that they otherwise could have. That practice is called that's how we track teachers. We talk a lot about tracking in terms of students, but our systems also track teachers in terms of how we pair teachers and students within our schedules. So paying attention to academic excellence for all of our students is one way that we can mitigate that. Now, the second tenet is cultural competence. And this is something that, as a white male from Texas, it took me a while to wrap my head around that, because I was brought up just, okay, this is the way we do things, but I never thought of that as having culture. Culture was something I thought of that other people had. But come to find out, I had it too. Something as simple as on Sunday, we'd gather at my grandparents' house for barbecue and a football game in the fall. That was just what we did, but come to find out that was part of my culture of growing up in Texas. And it's the things like the way we would gather, the reasons we would gather. What are we gathering to celebrate? Was it a birthday? Was it just Sunday, so we're going to mom's house or my parents' mom's house? What kind of food did we gather? What did we bring? In Texas, it was somebody put some meat on the grill. So there might be a brisket in the oven. There might be some sausage or whatever on the barbecue pit. That's just what we did. They don't do that in Massachusetts, by the way. So that was part of my culture. So cultural competence is building not just an awareness of other people's culture, but also your own, and thinking about the way that we interact with the world. And that's what culture is: the way we do things, the way we dress, the food that we eat, the way we interact with each other, the way that we greet people. I'm a hugger. Not everybody is. That's part of my culture. So if when I meet you, if you give any indication that you're a hugger too, you're going to get a hug. That's just part of my world. But that's not the case in everybody's culture. So cultural competence is becoming more aware of our own culture and the way we do things, as well as others. It's kind of like the dual language instruction model, where you're learning the content in multiple languages. So with cultural competence, you're learning the mathematics as it's framed around multiple cultures. In the Houston area, we had, of course, dual language models of Spanish and English at different elementary schools, but we also have a significant Asian population. So there are schools in Houston that do Mandarin Chinese and English immersion. There's also Vietnamese. Houston has the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam. And so there are elementary schools that do dual language Vietnamese and English for their instruction. And cultural competence is similar to that. You're focusing on the content and you're learning the content, but you're using multiple cultures as anchor points. And the third pillar, and the third tenet, is critical consciousness. And I think about this as why we learn mathematics to begin with. We're learning math so that we can interpret our world and make it a better place. Gloria Ladson-Billings called this critical consciousness or socio-political consciousness, this addresses the social justice component of teaching and learning. And so this is where you're using the math to identify, analyze, and solve real world problems, particularly those that emerge from social inequities. The example that I like to use is from the COVID experience. When COVID hit, it was March 13th, 2020, when my world shut down. I was in Dallas, and that's when the Dallas County judge, our chief executive, shut the place down. It was 10 p.m. on Friday night. I will remember that. And we spent the next month kind of in isolation. Everybody we followed the same model that we do for snow management in Texas. We hide under the bed till it goes away. And we were hoping that would happen with COVID, but spoiler alert, it didn't. So as we're coming out of that, we're trying to make sense of what's going on. And one of the first things we needed to find out was COVID testing. Where do you go to get tested for COVID? And so the county set up COVID tests all over, typically places, pharmacies, doctors' clinics, places where you would go for healthcare. Well, come to find out, in growing up in Houston, which was very integrated in terms of its population and the cultural dynamics, Dallas is very segregated. The Trinity River flows right through the city of Dallas. And so there's very much two cities. There's north of the river and south of the river. North of the river is whiter people with means. South of the river is more melanated and more economically disadvantaged. And there are historical, intentional, structural reasons that that's the case. But that's what's created the city of Dallas as it looks today. So as the news media is overlaying, where can you go get COVID testing? They had all these dots on the map. Well, guess what? North of the river was flush with dots. South of the river, it was hard to find a place to go get COVID testing. So then the news media is starting to look at, after we went through COVID testing, then it became vaccines. Similar patterns, lots of dots on the map north of the river, very few dots south of the river. So then the media started looking at, okay, this is interesting. So what else do we have clustered north of the river and south of the river? And come to find out, you saw similar patterns with things like financial institutions. Where do I go for the bank? Fresh food, where's the supermarket where I can access fresh meat and fresh produce? In healthcare, we saw that with the COVID pieces. So then we started to realize the media was making connections. There's a lot of social inequities that we can use mathematics to represent. And so the city government and the county government got to work on how they could encourage businesses to go and build south of the river. What kind of tax policies can we create? Tax incentives. And so we're making progress, but it took something like COVID to make us aware of what was going on. And that's part of the critical consciousness piece at the larger level of how we can use mathematics to frame and then solve problems that relate to social inequities. So those are the three pillars or tenets for culturally relevant pedagogy, and I kind of took a long way around that to illustrate some of that. I do want to talk now about the culturally responsive pedagogy model. And so this is a resource I want to make available to you. It's actually from the National Science Teachers Association, NSTA. They have an article that they published in 2021 that really lays these two frameworks side by side nicely, better than I could. So I thought, shoot, I don't want to repeat that. Let me just give them the article that they can go back and read. And so that'll give you some really good details from what I'm about to summarize in the next few slides. So the culturally responsive pedagogy framework was created by Dr. Geneva Gay. She's a professor and researcher at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the culturally responsive pedagogy framework describes the interplay between culture and learning. Specifically, that you're using cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and so forth to make learning encounters more relevant and effective for students. You're validating the culture and you're affirming the culture. I really like how she describes culturally responsive pedagogy as both routine and radical. So to make sense of that, think about where our public school model came from. We still have the American 19th century factory model. That is how we set up our schools. Our classrooms are organized that way. We're moving students in and out, very much factory style. In that 20th century landscape that we wrapped around this, centered the experiences of white middle-class culture. In parts of the country where we had segregated schools, whether it was segregating Black students from their white peers or Mexican American students from their white peers, which is what happened in the borderlands, then when we desegregated our schools, we didn't change the way we ran them. We just took all the students of color and plunged them into the white school and said, good luck. So our school systems are set up with a very Eurocentric view of what mathematics is used for. And the rhythms and the policies and the structures are set up from a mostly white, mostly middle-class perspective. And so our school systems are set up to, the way we set that up is the experiences of white middle-class students are routine in the school system. So with culturally responsive pedagogy, it makes routine for other students what has always been routine for white students, that their cultural experiences become part of the way we do school. And with the curriculum content and the teaching strategies, we filter those through multiple cultural frames of reference. And that's what makes it more personalized for students that come from different cultures. It makes routine for all students what has always been routine for white middle-class students. And that's what makes it radical, because it does make explicit what we've always had as an implicit role of culture in teaching and learning. And that radicalness really comes to the foray in Zaretta Hammond's work. Zaretta Hammond, the book Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, she masterfully connects neuroscience with culturally responsive teaching. And Ms. Hammond is a language arts specialist from the San Francisco Bay Area. And she built on Dr. Gay's work and bridged it to the classroom. She marries the neurology of how does the brain actually absorb and make sense of information with culturally responsive teaching. And the kind of the cornerstone of her work is, if you think of the brain as a computer that processes information, because that's what our brain does. Our senses bring information in, our brain makes sense of it, decides what's worth keeping, how to frame it, and then it sticks it in our long-term memory. So if the brain is a computer that processes that information, culture is the software. Culture is how we interpret what goes on in the world based on how we see and do things, what's familiar to us. Our language, our linguistic patterns are part of our culture. The way that we interact with each other, the way that we frame our human relationships with one another, that's culturally based. And so that's why culture plays such an important role in teaching and learning, because that's how our brain makes sense of it. Remember, teaching and learning is a human endeavor. These are humans in the room. And so anytime you get two people interacting with each other, whether it's student to student or teacher to student, culture's at play, because our culture is how we make sense of what goes on around us. One more device that I like to use to make sense of this is the metaphor of windows and mirrors. And this comes from the work of Rudine Sims Bishop and Rochelle Gutierrez. So Dr. Bishop is a literacy professor. And so she originally came up with the metaphor of mirrors and windows when to help teachers teach literature. And so with this, students, as they're interacting with literature, they're reading a story, sometimes they see themselves in the story, and in that case it becomes a mirror. Sometimes they see other cultures, other people in the story, and then it becomes a window into a different culture. So I remember as an elementary student, I grew up in suburban Houston, and I didn't realize it then, but when I started kindergarten in 1978, my school district had just desegregated their schools in 1977. So I was a kindergartner enrolled in a freshly desegregated school. And so I didn't know why all of the students of color got on the same bus and went to an apartment complex I had never heard of, because it wasn't in my neighborhood. I didn't understand all of that until I was an adult living in the same community. I didn't know that part of my school's history. But part of that, I remember in early grades, first and second grade, the teacher would bring the TV cart in there, and that was a big deal. When she brought the TV in from the library on the cart, we knew we were going to have a good time. And sometimes we watched like Sesame Street or Electric Company episodes. Sometimes it would be a movie, but there was one movie I remember that stuck out. It was called Evan's Corner. And it was a story of an elementary school age boy and his family that lived in a one-room apartment in a high-rise building. Well, that was foreign to me. That was a window for me into somebody else's culture. And it was called Evan's Corner because it was such a small room, that the small apartment he was sharing with his family. His mother decided, here, we're going to set up this corner and that's going to be your space. So he didn't have a bedroom like I did. He had a corner in an apartment. And that was hard for me to relate to because that wasn't my culture. But I now know that that was a window into somebody else's culture living in a more urban environment instead of a suburban environment. So Dr. Bishop set up the mirrors and windows framework thinking about literature. Dr. Gutierrez, who's a professor at the University of Illinois, brought that into mathematics. And she said, if this works for literature, it also works for mathematical context, because we know that contextual math problems are important. We need to teach math in a context. And anytime you've got a context at play, there's culture. So the question for a math problem isn't, is there culture? It's whose culture is represented there. And that comes from Dr. Gutierrez's work. And so we can use the mirrors and windows metaphor to illuminate the mathematics tasks that we select, because some of the contexts that we have are going to be mirrors for some of our students and windows for others. And when we're in a multicultural classroom, eventually everybody's going to get a mirror and everybody's going to get a window. That's why it's important to know who's in the room and then select math tasks that are relevant to the different cultures represented. So why is this important? We know from recent school years, and COVID interrupted our data collection, but in the 2017-18 school year, Our teaching faculty was 79% white, but our student body was only 48% white. So we have majority white, majority female teachers teaching students that are majority of color. We have an increasing number of students that are multi-language learners, and we have gender balance in schools. So we have many of our students can go through their elementary and middle school careers and not have a male teacher until they get to high school. For Black students and Hispanic students, it's more likely than not that they never have a teacher that looks like them. We also know we have multicultural classrooms, and they are ripe for windows, mirrors, and the third part of Dr. Bishop's metaphor is sliding glass doors, where you can actually open that window and step into that world temporarily. It's also important to have an asset-based view of the cultural funds of knowledge that students bring with them from home to the classroom. The idea of cultural funds of knowledge comes from Martha Siviela's work. She's a professor at the University of Arizona, and she describes the cultural funds of knowledge as the cultural knowledge that students come in with that we typically don't harness when they're in the classroom. And that's a tremendous source of knowledge that we've left untapped. And we can make our mathematics instruction richer if we look for ways to tap into those funds. And I have talked for quite a long time, so it's time for me to share some tools with y'all, and we're going to do a little bit more interaction. So I want to shift now to how can we make our math tasks more culturally relevant? So here's the problem. There are publishers out there, and part of what I do for a living is write mathematics instructional materials. So I'm indicting my people. There are publishers that will tell you, we have a culturally relevant curriculum. Well, those publishers are lying to you because they don't know who's in your class. So they don't know what's relevant. They don't know what cultures are there, let alone what's relevant to them. So there is a myth that you can purchase an off-the-shelf culturally relevant curriculum, and that is a myth. So let's dispel that right now. And y'all, that's part of what's making this work so difficult. I meant both the culturally relevant pedagogy framework and the culturally responsive pedagogy framework are from the 1990s. Y'all, that was 30 years ago. When I was teaching in high school, we were studying The Dream Keepers as a new book. And it's like, yeah, great idea. Let's do this. But it's hard. It's really hard. So I think that's part of why the work hasn't taken off yet, because it's difficult to pull off. And so we have to turn to each other to do that. And so that's what this section of our time together is looking at some ways that we can take the existing tasks that we have and make them more relevant to the kids in the room. So this is something that we've done with NCSM for a little bit. This draws from the work of Pam Seda, who is one of our board members right now. She's the president-elect of the Benjamin Banneker Association, and she's a consultant in the Atlanta, Georgia area. So she's created a framework where there's 4 stages of culturally relevant tasks. In the first stage, and let me give you a link that has this information in it. This is a PDF. I'm going to give you a link to the Word document here in a bit that describes these 4 stages of culturally relevant tasks. Stage 1 is you're starting out with a good, rock-solid, standard-based math tasks, and it graduates through to 4 different stages where you're replacing some of the names in the context that's more meaningful, or that you're replacing some of the names and you're replacing the context. But then the 4th stage is getting into that critical consciousness piece where you're empowering your students to be change agents. You're empowering them to take the mathematics that they're learning and use it to make their world a better place. So stage 1 is if you start with a good standards-based math task that engages students in the mathematical practices. And these are good tasks. These are tasks that if I were if I were coaching a teacher and walked into the classroom and he or she was using a task like this, I'd be happy because it's good, powerful mathematics. But sometimes the context and the task itself doesn't necessarily resonate with the students' cultures in the room. And so that's where stage 2 comes in. You're going to take that good task and tinker with it a little bit. You're going to replace some of the names that are so that it's more meaningful to your students. So in this example, on the left-hand side, we've got the robotics club task where they're doing a fundraiser, they're selling pizza and a cup of water. It's a good task. There's some powerful mathematics here. But in a way that you can kind of personalize this with your students and make it a stage 2 task is replace the name of your local school with the name of your school, say West Point Middle School, and then personalize it. And I did this when I was teaching high school. I didn't realize I was pushing into the boundaries of culturally relevant instruction, but I would just take some of my kids that were in the class and pop their name in the problem. I did it to make them pay attention, but come to find out, it made it more personalized to them. So when Saritha's name pops up in the problem, you can bet that Saritha is going to sit up a little straighter and make sure everybody's paying attention because now this is her problem. But it also personalizes the mathematics a little bit because now we're not just working with some weird numbers out there, but now it's a little bit more relevant. This is we may not be the robotics club. And if I had some cheerleaders in there, I might make it the cheerleaders. If I had some athletes in there, I might make it the athletic booster club or something like that, just to make it relevant to the kids in the room. Because the point's not the robotics club, the point is the mathematics. That we've got this cost of a slice of pizza with a cup of water, the difference between the pizza and the water. So how much would we charge for each item separately? Getting kids to think about how you're composing and decomposing $1.10. Not bad that Mr. High School knows what composing and decomposing numbers is. A stage 3 task is where you dress the context up a little bit. So in this case, we're all familiar with the story of Rosa Parks. We may be less familiar with the story of Claudette Colvin, though I did notice on my Facebook, this was making the rounds. She had a birthday here recently. But in 1955, Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old African-American girl in Montgomery, Alabama, and she had also refused to give up her seat on the bus. But the ACLU didn't think that that was a really good test case because she was a pregnant 15-year-old teenage girl. So when Rosa Parks did the same thing later, that's the court case that sprouted legs. But Claudette Colvin, a teenager, did the same thing. The reason you might want to bring that up if you're teaching high school, your students might relate more to a 15-year-old than to this image we have in our heads of Rosa Parks, this adult woman or old woman that was tired and refused to give up her seat on the bus. Not to diminish her contributions to civil rights and American culture, but there's, like with most things in our history, there's more to the story. And Claudette Colvin's story is part of that. So and we all know that after the bus, we had the bus boycott in Montgomery. But the thing is, people still had to get to work. So if they weren't taking the bus, they had to figure out how to get to work because everybody still had to put food on their table and take care of their families. And so that's where the Black taxi drivers got together. And they decided, you know what, we're going to support the bus boycott by taking people to work. We'll transport them and we'll get creative about it. So with that context, you can take something that has preserve the mathematics, change the context. So I love the birdhouse problem. I think this is kind of cool, but this is a nice stage 1 task that came from Student Achievement Partners. And it's really powerful. You got 56 birdhouses at school. Today, 4 classes made more birdhouses. Each class made 8. So now how many total are there? So this is an elementary multi-step problem with operations and whole numbers. But you can take that same mathematics, shift the context. Instead of the birdhouses, now let's talk about the bus boycott, where the taxi driver charges 8 cents per passenger First hour, he made 56 cents. The second hour transported 4 more people. Same mathematics. But now the context is a little bit different. So where your bird watching students, the stage 1 task would have been culturally relevant to them. Because if they got a birdhouse in their backyard, or there's a birdhouse in the city park near their home, then they're familiar with that. But for other students, when you pull in the history of the bus boycott, now you've layered in some culture that might be a mirror for some of your students and a window for others. Stage 4 task is where it gets a little bit wiki. So this is where you're moving into the social justice piece. So thinking about the birdhouse problem, how can we preserve the mathematics, but change the context to make it something that's more relevant to what's going on in our neighborhood? And the critical consciousness piece is where students are using the mathematics to make their world a better place. So this is where we get to think about, what do we mean by their world? Sometimes the world is global, like we want to change the whole planet. Sometimes the world is we want to change the country, state, or city. Sometimes the world is we just need to improve our neighborhood. And you know what? That's part of the world. So if we're making some changes at the school level, the community level, the neighborhood level, that's improving our world. We're empowering our students to be agents of change. So we may want to look for patterns in, like, do we have pollinating plants for the local bees and butterflies? Do the grocery store or healthcare deserts? I mentioned that earlier for Dallas. Other communities have similar issues. What about resource allocation in the school? What do we have in the school bookstore? What kind of food is available in the school cafeteria? Is it the same at our school and the neighboring school? You can look, you're using the mathematics to poke at the social justice issues that are in our communities. There are sources for social justice and culturally relevant math tasks that are out there. And sometimes we just need some examples of, okay, how would I take this mathematics and switch the context around a little bit, especially if we're moving into cultures that we're not really familiar with, that are different from our own. So these are 3 of my favorite books right now. There's one from NCTM called Rethinking Mathematics, that we're teaching social justice by the numbers. There's a series from Robert Berry, Basil Conway, Brian Lawler, and John Staley, where they started with high school mathematics lessons to explore social injustices. And there's a middle school and an elementary companion to those. And then Lou Matthews, Shelley Jones, and Yolanda Parker have a book series out. We're engaging in culturally relevant math tasks. They started at the elementary level, but they also now have books for middle school and high school, where there's exemplar tasks in there that you can use in your own classroom practice, but also in a PLC with other teachers. You can almost take a lesson study approach to it, where, okay, here's a particular task. How might we modify this for our students? It's always easier to start with something and tweak it than it is to try and make it from scratch. So these are rich sources for tasks that promote students in the role of change agents, where you're not just using the mathematics to solve a problem. That's the what, but then you get into the so what. How do I use that math to make my world a better place? And speaking of Lou Matthews, Shelley Jones, and Yolanda Parker, this is a link you're going to want. It's a rubric they've developed. The culturally relevant, cognitively demanding rubrics. So it's, if you're using tasks in a PLC setting with teachers, some kind of a lesson study, how do I take this task and make it more culturally relevant while I'm preserving the cognitive demand? This rubric is a great way to do that. So they've got 3 levels of tasks, where the emerging level is you're taking care of the cognitive demand, but it's not really culturally relevant. And that's a great starting point, because for any math task, you have to have the cognitive demand, or it may not be a task worth doing. And remember the academic excellence tenet in Gloria Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant teaching framework. You have to attend to the academic excellence, or the rest of it doesn't matter as much. So that's the emerging level. You're taking care of that academic excellence. There's some cognitive effort required in the task. The second level is developing, where you've got the cognitive effort and you're embedding the task in cultural self or community inquiry. So you've got some of the cultural relevance in there. The task is centered in real world situations that require students to think about themselves, their communities, and the world around them. You're requiring students to draw from, use, and embrace community and cultural knowledge directly in how they're solving the problem. And the task is seeking to add this knowledge through mathematical activity. So this is the cultural competence tenet that's coming in there. We've got the academic excellence. Now we're weaving in the cultural competence. And then that gets you to the third level, which is exemplary. And that's where you're doing all of that, and you're introducing empowerment and social justice. This is that change agent piece. Are we taking the mathematics? This is that third tenet. Are we taking all of the mathematics and using it to make our world a better place? And again, world is not necessarily the globe. World can be our neighborhood. And sometimes world is my household. So this is, we've got 10 minutes left. Is that right, Heather?
Yeah, we have 10 minutes, and during that time, you'll just need to also have a couple minutes to fill out their attendance and survey as well.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of cut to the chase a little bit. The link I just put in here, I gave you the PDF earlier. This will make a Google Doc that you can, it's a forced copy link. So it'll make a copy for you to kind of write in. It's the culturally relevant task modification form, where you're going through those 4 stages of tasks. So that's a tool that when you go back and you're working with teachers, or you're doing a self-reflection exercise, I've got this task, how do I make it more culturally relevant to the kids in my room? This is a writable document. I gave you the PDF, but this is a Google Doc you can type in. So I do want to go ahead then and talk about some of my reflections and implications. And we do know that one of the things that determines students, one of the biggest determinants in what mathematics a student gets to interact with, is the task the teacher selects. Those are critically important for students in terms of the mathematics they're going to learn and the mathematical experiences they will have. And so when we're selecting those tasks, we need to make sure that they provide windows and mirrors for students from a variety of cultural backgrounds. And here's the kicker, and this is Mr. High School talking. High school teachers tend to like their content more than their children. So if to engage in culturally relevant instruction, you gotta know who's in the room. More than just the name and the face. You've got to know more about the kids themselves. You've got to know the humans that you're spending time with. Once you build the relationships and get to know more about their culture, then you're working more from the direct experience of the students rather than relying on stereotypes that may or may not be true. And that's part of what makes this work so hard, is you've got to build those relationships with the students. Culturally relevant tasks are not found in your textbook, on Pinterest, or Teachers Pay Teachers. In spite of what may be stated out there, you just can't find them on the shelf. You've got to take the tasks that you have and tweak them. And that's part of the power of working with your teachers or your colleagues together in a PLC type model, is that you get to do that work together. And because this is new and it's and it's not easy work. The professional learning is essential. One of the biggest things that our administrators can do to support this work is to create space and time for teachers to get together and do it. And the professional learning is important, giving teachers the chance to learn about this together, and then very much follow a lesson study model. Plan, go teach it, and then come back together with the results and reflect on it. What worked well? What should we do next time? What should we do differently? That's part of the professional learning cycle. It's a coaching model, but it works for teachers to build their own study together as well. I did mention some NCSM resources. So with the people that are here, I told Janie that I would do 1 door prize, but I'm going to do 4 door prizes. So I will get what I'm going to do. NCSM has a book series, the Essential Action Series, and right now we've got four volumes in there. So there's the Framework for Leadership in Mathematics Education, which is the kind of the foundation book, the foundation piece. But then we also have supplemental pieces with instructional leadership, coaching, and then our newest one is culturally relevant leadership. And that's kind of the basis of this presentation. So our door prize is you're going to get a copy of the Framework for Leadership in Mathematics Education. So I'm going to be mailing that to you. I'll get your mailing address from Heather. I just want to make sure that we've got the 4 of you that are here in the room.
I'm just going to say, if you'll just private message me in the chat, I'll save them all. And that way I don't have to find you later.
Perfect.
So if you want your door prize, message me in the chat. There is one condition to winning your door prize.
I mentioned our conference that's coming up. So that's going to be Washington, D.C., and it's at the end of October. It's the end of next month. And I looked at the registration list earlier yesterday. I had to process it to get some information out to some of my board colleagues, and we've got a decent number of people from Nevada that are coming to Washington. So hopefully we can see you and your colleagues at our conference. It's normally NCSM is before NCTM. We call it Math Week. But this year, because of a scheduling conflict, there's something going on in Washington at the beginning of Math Week. So our conference is going to be after NCTM. So it's still Math Week. It's just going to look a little different. NCTM's kicking it off on Wednesday. And then our opening session is going to be Saturday night, October 28th. And then our conference will be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Tuesday is Halloween, and we'll wrap up around mid-afternoon so people can get home. And I get to have a conference on Halloween. I'm going to have fun with that. Our podcasts are really cool, and we got new episodes that come out on the 11th of each month. This year's theme is We're All Math People, and our podcast hosts are our president-elect, Dr. Katie Arrington, and Dr. Brian Buckhalter, who's our incoming professional learning director. So they've been tag teaming on the podcast, and they're both really entertaining, both incredibly smart and fun to listen to. So if you're a podcast person, I encourage you to take a look at the NCSM podcast series. We talked to Katie and Brian talked to rock stars in our field and kind of pick their brain. We've also got a new position paper that's out. It came out this last year, Positioning Multilingual Learners for Success in Mathematics. I think that's something that might be particularly relevant to you in your work. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. Put that link in the chat box also. Pretty much we partnered with Todos and staked out the claim that we must prioritize policies and practices that not just provide supports for multilingual learners, but position them for success so that they can access, engage, and thrive in mathematics education. Not just give them access, but actually make sure they're successful. And with that, we are approaching our final parts. We've got a couple minutes left, so I do want to make sure you know how to find me. That's my email address. And you can follow me or NCSM on Twitter. And don't be a stranger. Let me know how things are going. There's an attendance and survey link that Heather put in the chat box. I'm going to freshen that so that it's at the bottom again. And then make sure you've private messaged me or Heather your name and mailing address, and I'll send you your door prize. We've got a couple minutes left. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain those.
And if none, I'm just going to thank Paul again for spending the morning with us. And that was great. So many good resources. So many good resources. Thank you for sharing. I'm also going to share one more plug with you all. It is Presidential Awards for Math and Science Teaching nominations are open right now. And it is a elementary year. So I encourage you, beg you, implore you to please go to pames.nsf.gov and nominate a great teacher does a great job teaching math or science or computer science or engineering in grades K through 6. And if that is you, nominate yourself. There's a self-apply button. Just click it. Do it. There's nothing wrong with nominating yourself. Nominate your great colleagues. Get the word out that applications are available now. Nominations are open until January 8th, but the earlier someone gets nominated, the longer they have to complete their application. So give them the gift of time by doing it today instead of on, I don't know, January 7th. And thank you. Thank you for being here today too. Hey, look, it's exactly 10:20. Somewhere someone should give me a sticker.
Y'all enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks for spending part of your morning with me.